On today's episode of New Kinship, TJ and I get to talk with our friend Julia Sadusky, who is a licensed psychologist who is also Catholic. And she's been involved in some recent discussions related to the Chiles versus Salazar Supreme Court case. We had a lot of questions coming in, and we actually still have a lot of questions about how are Christians continuing to think about conversion therapy? And what does that mean? What counts as conversion therapy? So, as we get into this discussion, Julia is a supporter of what we call the Side B movement or Side B position, which is distinct from the Side A position in Christian faith. The Side A position would say God supports and blesses same-sex marriages and same-sex sexual activity. Side B says that God loves queer people, same-sex attracted people, and has redemptive possibilities for them, but that same-sex marriage is not actually on the table. There's also what we call a side X position that says that it's actually God's normative will for Christians who do experience same-sex attraction to be doing reparative, healing, converting work in their sexual orientation to become more heterosexual, and that should be desired, normative, something in that range. And so this case in the law kind of intersects that discussion, which is often framed, as you will hear, as kind of a side A versus side X discussion without a nuanced perspective of how Christians can really come alongside people who are seeking licensed care in this way. And the question of this episode is just what's going on in this court case? What's going on in conversion therapy? What are its actual tenets, practices? What's the research behind it? TJ and I have been interested in learning more about this, and so this has been a fantastic opportunity to get to hear from Julia a bit more on something that is immediately present with this court case, but also an enduring question for especially Christians who are trying to understand sexuality and therapy. TJ and I hold a side B position and have personally never experienced conversion therapy, either in my experiences with same-sex attraction or TJ and his experiences of sexuality or gender incongruence. But it's always been in the air informing how Christians think about things, what kind of assumptions they have around what should or shouldn't happen. We're really grateful for Julia Sadusky's expertise in this area. So we hope that you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of New Kinship. We are really glad to have Julia Sadusky here with us. Thank you so much, Julia, for joining.
So good to be with you both.
For those, you've been making the rounds on a lot of different podcasts and other places. But before we get into why, could you just share a little bit about who you are, where you're from, important people in your life?
Yeah, so I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in Delaware, which people often tell me they've never met anybody from Delaware. So if that's you, I'm one of them that left. But I grew up there in kind of a big Catholic family. So one of 7 kids. And I went to college down in South Florida and then spent time studying in Virginia and then lived in California for a year before making my way to Colorado. And that's where I have a private practice and I live there and have been there since about 2019. So as far as just personally, I mean, I'm really close to my family, my siblings. I've got nieces and a nephew and love getting to travel and surprise and go see them and lots of dear friends right now. I'm joining from the Twin Cities. I told you guys because I'm staying with some good friends who run an invitation and getting to have a change of pace.
Wow.
That's great. I'll have to tell you another time my one story from someone else from Delaware. And
Please do.
so now you just further confirm my positive thoughts about people from Delaware.
Sure.
Thank God.
Julia, we know that you are a psychologist
Mhm.
by training. Could you tell us more about how you got into psychology from your kind of background, or what was that path like for you?
Yeah, so I am. I should say that I'm a licensed psychologist, right? And so I had some people in my life growing up who, experienced mental illness and went to therapy. And I just bore witness to how poorly sometimes therapists show up for people. And I think at a very young age, about 12 or 13, I had this conviction that I wanted to be a therapist who showed up for people more effectively than what I was witnessing. So I was always kind of a natural listener and empath and very attuned to my environment. And so I think that was a little bit of what was the catalyst for me getting into psychology at a pretty young age. And then when I was studying in undergrad, I really came across a lot of writings around human sexuality and theology. And then I came across Mark Yarhouse's work, and it just felt like a very natural fit to some of the questions I was asking at the time as people I loved were coming out to me as gay or same-sex attracted, and were really asking questions about faith and identity and how does faith and sexuality fit. And I was so aware as a straight person that there was not a lot that I was being taught in the church that was helpful as far as how to walk with people. And so that was a real catalyst too for not just my work in psychology more broadly, but in this area of sexuality in particular.
Wow.
Could you share just a little bit of how you see spirituality and psychology connecting or working together? Because for a lot of Christians, those can feel like there's tension between those.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's for good reason, right? That people see a tension there. So much of historical psychology and modern psychology is rooted in non-theistic views of the person. And so I think for a lot of people, there is a kind of suspicion, or in psychology, at times we've pathologized people of faith as if they're kind of uniquely using the crutch of spirituality. And so there's good reason, I think, to be cautious and kind of taking in these theories without just taking them in whole, right? And so I'm a big fan of critically evaluating psychology in a way that is distinctively Christian. And at the same time, right, all the sciences reflect something true about reality, about God, about ourselves. And so I think in that way, the study of the soul, which is what psychology means, is a way that we really account for something beyond the material world in ourselves, in our very selves. And so I think actually psychology at its best is naturally and necessarily integrative of faith, that you can't, I think, have a really robust psychology person without understanding theological and kind of philosophical sensibilities that Christianity, again, one at its best, can really contribute something distinct and unique there.
Wow. That's good. So I had become exposed to your work mostly through a couple of years ago through your connections with Mark Yarhouse, whose work I had a little bit more connection to. And I think you might have studied under him, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that true? Yeah?
Right. Yeah, I studied under him at Regent. Yeah.
Yep. So I wanted to get into kind of a common question for Side B people, and also people who maybe are on the peripheries or the outskirts of Side B. They might have a different position, but we wanted to talk more about the idea of conversion therapy. Like, yeah, this conversion therapy was like a part of psychological practice, and maybe at least in some circles in the US in, I don't know, maybe the past 30 or 40 years or something like that. Yeah, could you tell us more about this topic? Because we know that you've considered this through your own studies and your own work. Yeah, what is this conversion therapy that has been talked about and that many people fear now?
Yeah, conversion therapy, as far as I can tell, and it's an umbrella term, right, to understand kind of different therapeutic approaches, theories, and practices in therapy that view, number one, homosexuality as a kind of developmental arresting or a kind of conflict in typical kind of sexual development, and would then say that if you can help through therapeutic intervention and various theories and various practices to maybe heal a person of some of the maybe kind of developmental arresting that happened, as the theory goes, then you can help a person change their sexual orientation or align their sense of embodiment with their biological sex. So again, there's lots of theories that have been used to kind of seek that goal of change of orientation or change person's sense of embodiment. But I think that the fundamental shared idea is that if we can use psychological intervention effectively, we can change or tweak or create the outcome of shift in attraction to heterosexuality.
And in case, I mean, for some people, they might just viscerally feel why this is so controversial. But could you share why this conversation has been so controversial and even prominent?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to name, right, is this is not an abstract thing. I mean, listeners have sought therapy probably at some times, either in the hopes that their attractions or orientation would shift, or kind of with a therapist claiming that there are ways to make those alterations and adjustments through therapy. Or people have sat in church contexts and heard talks given or testimonies given where people shared that they've experienced these types of changes, whether it was through ministry or through therapy. And so I think for people, specifically people of faith who are asking questions about how does my sexuality fit with my faith, if people are highly religious and they're getting the message that there's a way to kind of experience heterosexual attraction, which for some people feels like it opens up possibilities for marriage and family life and kind of biological parenthood, the stakes are pretty high of these claims as far as if they're possible, if it's possible to change orientation. That's very motivating for people, right? For parents, for young people. And if it's not possible and it's being promised, what I've witnessed is enormous alienation from people's faith. When it doesn't happen, enormous alienation from their parents. If the theories around conversion approaches are framing the parents as the cause of somebody's sexual attraction, and certainly enormous barriers for people getting access to quality mental health care in the future. And so I think right now there's a Supreme Court case that I'm sure we'll talk about more that is looking at whether conversion therapy ought to be banned in minors because of some of the controversy around it and some of the harm that's been documented in research around conversion therapy practices.
Yeah.
Can we talk more about the success rates of these interventions? Like, because it's often a prominent point in the discussion. I still hear people in churches that I'm around sometimes, still older people typically, talk about it as if this is still a live intervention that people should pursue. But then a lot of younger people generally have the impression that the interventions are not mostly helpful for the goals they have. Yeah, could you shed some light on that from your particular studies or research about, what are these success rates, or are they there? Are they not? What sort of changes have been documented or not?
So I should say that, when I was in grad school, I was really interested in whether conversion therapy was effective. And I think I went into it, I was studying Nicolosi Sr.'s research and kind of some of the claims he was making because he was Catholic and I was Catholic. And so I was really interested. What is there in reparative therapy was that form of it.
Mhm.
And as I looked at the research, not just his research and documented efficacy, but the broader research base, what really struck me initially was a lot of the early data, if you will, was rooted in case studies and case studies that really fit certain narratives of specifically male homosexuality and a kind of hypersexuality within that, and trying to make causal links between family of origin or development and peer relationships as the catalyst for these things. And at that time, what struck me about that was, number one, none of the data being presented was coming from robust kind of clinical trials of people that would have given us any way of claiming causal links between some of the theories and some of these outcomes in attraction to the same sex. So that was the first thing. And I think that's worth knowing, that in order to make a causal claim about the cause of homosexuality, for instance, you have to have specific types of studies done. And those studies have not been done with any level of rigor that would give me confidence to say I know what causes a person's sexual orientation. And really the applications that are happening today in conversion therapy, so things like use of EMDR to address kind of developmental traumas, and the claim that if we can address the trauma, we should see some shifts around attraction. Those rely on theories that lack a research base. And so I think that's really important to name. The other piece here is, not a ton of research has been done on these types of therapies. And I already mentioned it's an umbrella term. Conversion therapy is not one type of intervention or one type of therapy. It's not like studying acceptance and commitment therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, where you have pretty specific protocols. And so when you look at the research, that also limits what we can say from that research about effectiveness. But when I look at what we have, I mean, Mark Yarhouse did a longitudinal study looking at ministries attempting to change attraction and orientation and identity and behavior. And a lot of these studies that we do have are pretty imprecise when claims are made of outcomes of change. And what do I mean by that? Many people would report at some point in monitoring kind of the outcomes of these therapies, changes in identity, meaning the labels I use to talk about myself, some changes in behavior. Maybe I refrain from sexual activity at the end of therapy with a little bit more ease. But when you look at the actual measures of attraction, we're not seeing any remarkable shifts towards heterosexuality. And if we are seeing a kind of acquiring of a capacity to be in a heterosexual partnership, which sometimes people report, like I went to therapy and over time I was kind of able to be in a heterosexual relationship, what we're not seeing is a eradication of same-sex attraction. Overwhelmingly, I think, Mark Yarhouse's research was like maybe 30% reported any shift in attraction of any kind. And what that also doesn't account for is what we understand well in the field, which is natural fluidity. We know that people experience ebbs and flows in attraction over time. And you would have to, again, do pretty significant research studies where you're applying people to conversion therapy and then others of a similar cohort to not receive conversion therapy, monitor attraction over time, and take kind of a long-term view, so not 1 year or 6-month follow-up, but 2-year, 5-year follow-up to really get a sense for if these interventions are working. And because of the evidence of harm that has, been reported by studies, plenty of studies over time with adults, I think we have reason to be very cautious about the claims of any type of therapy that says we know how to change attraction or orientation as such.
That's really helpful, and maybe already kind of answered a question I had around why people who are promoting conversion therapy or Sidex ministry seem to be going to some of these same studies of saying, look, there's success. And it's like, wait, these are the same studies
30% said some shift. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, maybe we can just speak to a little bit of that. Have you seen other people go to some of these same studies that you see? Well, actually, it's not so successful when you dig into the details. What's going
Right.
on there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think when you look on the landing pages for some of the prominent iterations of this approach today, there are pretty kind of far-reaching claims, I would say, about what's actually being demonstrated from the data. And if I give the benefit of the doubt in that, I do think people who are invested in these approaches, whether there's a personal connection to them or a professional connection to them, have a vested interest. And that's true for anybody, right? If we develop an approach or kind of, I think people want it to be helpful for people in the ways that they're claiming. And so I think there probably are some vested interests that shape then the claims and the excitement and the kind of far-reaching sense that overwhelmingly people are experiencing shifts in attraction over the course of this research and therapy. At the exact same time, though, what I hear from people who are engaging in some of these practices today is that they don't believe conversion therapy is happening. And they also don't believe they're doing conversion therapy. So I find that interesting as well. Because I do think if I'm not particularly interested in changing people's attractions or orientation. I also don't think it's plausible or possible based on the research we have. So I don't measure a person's attraction in therapy, right? But some of these research studies are measuring attraction.
Mm.
And then when you dig into the statistics of it all, it becomes very evident to me as a researcher that there are very limited pieces of evidence within the actual data that's being presented that show any significant shift that would be robust and meaningful away from attraction to the same sex. Again, it's one thing to show some level of natural fluidity.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say overwhelmingly people are changing their attractions. Because again, it's one thing, and maybe listeners can relate to this, to have a kind of feeling of attraction towards somebody who you see at a grocery store or who you walk by on the street and you think, wow, they're really attractive or they're really beautiful. I can see them as attractive. It's another thing for that to mean you can be in a heterosexual relationship, which is another layer to what many people are hoping for here, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
that has a lot to do with behavior. That has a lot to do with just the sustainability of identity development in somebody. And so I think any of the benefits that are happening in some of these approaches would happen in any form of therapy where you create a trusted bond with a provider who cares about you. And I believe people doing these approaches sometimes really do care about their clients. And I bet people feel that. Does that mean attraction's changing overwhelmingly? I don't think so. And when I press people who have even undergone these approaches, who will say, well, I don't use those labels anymore, or I've been able to really be kind of refrain from sexual activity, and that feels really value congruent for me. Again, what I would offer is there are plenty of therapies that help with that don't at all measure attraction. And again, when you dig into that data and when I press people to look at it who have undergone it, I've gotten feedback from them at times that says, oh, I actually see here that this is not a categorical shift. And I think some of the researchers are also a little bit less likely right now than ever before to claim that their approaches are changing attraction as such. And I find that interesting as well. I think there's maybe a little bit more of a nuance arising as there's a pressing of some of these
Yeah.
research studies.
I was just going to say, I can really relate to natural fluidity and that being something that just personal experience over time, and be like, oh yeah, growth in behavior, changes in how I identify, those all things happened without going to any therapies. So it's good to hear you kind of talk about. Go ahead, TJ.
I wanted to ask more about these evolutions from the past approaches. Like, for example, I've heard you talk about, I think it's called reintegration therapy or reintegrative therapy, which
Reintegrative therapy.
I understand this as an evolution from past, what we call reparative or conversion therapy approaches. Did the people who are engaged in this reintegrative therapy, do they see themselves as having some continuity from those past approaches, or do they see themselves as not? And then how do they conceptualize their difference? Even if we might categorize them under this, like David Frank and I might categorize them as under the same umbrella. Yeah, I don't know if you know.
Good question. I do have a sense of that. So
Anything?
yeah, so Joseph Nicolosi Jr. is the son of Joseph Nicolosi Sr., who was a prominent kind of researcher and clinical practitioner who developed something called reparative therapy. And so when I reference approaches that are focused more on this kind of framing around homosexuality as a kind of developmental arrest or a relational trauma, that really emerged in a significant way, not exclusively by Nicolosi Sr., but significantly from him. And so when I did a video kind of engaging with some of the research being posited around reintegrative therapy, because that is actually really prominent in the circles I'm part of in the Catholic denomination. And so I took an interest in it. And again, similarly, I think the research was lacking in anything that could be claimed around orientation and attraction. And the feedback I got from people who practice that approach and some of the feedback I got in a written exchange that I received from Nicolosi Jr. was that they would not see themselves as doing conversion therapy because they see the shifts that are happening in attraction as almost secondary, a byproduct of the trauma treatment. So I
Mhm,
think the
mhm.
claim would be that what they're doing is competent trauma therapy, and then
Okay.
they're kind of witnessing shifts in attraction. Similarly, they're kind of applying reintegrative therapy to things like eating disorders, and I think that's
Mhm.
maybe in the hopes of saying this isn't just a treatment for same-sex attraction, this is a treatment
Yeah.
for broader symptoms.
Hmm.
What I would often that is I what I hear from that is that there's a framing around homosexuality as if it's a mental health symptom to be
Yeah. Yes.
measured,
Hmm.
therapeutic
Yep.
outcome, in the same way that eating disorders are diagnosable,
Hmm.
disorders.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one question I have. The other question I have is if you really are not interested in claiming that you're changing attraction through therapy, why measure it at all? And
Sure.
why have the landing page be so focused on the attraction piece, which
Yeah.
people care about, and
Hmm.
seemingly only secondarily focused on the shifts in mental health symptoms
Yeah.
more broadly, depression, anxiety, and suicidality.
Hmm. Okay. Thank you. I'd love to learn more about that someday. But I was going to ask now. So my understanding is, I don't know how many years ago, but the American Psychological Association, APA, they wrote a report which then kind of stopped a lot of these reparative or conversion therapy approaches as being seen like the standard of care, like the standard practice that was worth pursuing. Could you tell us more about that history if I'm understanding that basic summary well? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in the 1970s, homosexuality was removed from the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, which really meant that as research was being done on people who experience attraction to the same sex, the kind of awareness was becoming clear that there was a spectrum of kind of mental health in that community, as much as there's a spectrum in the mental health of heterosexual identifying people. And so it seemed apparent that there wasn't a separate kind of diagnosis for homosexuality. And so that was removed, right, at that time. There was a kind of category of people who you might say had what we called ego dystonic homosexuality, where there was maybe a conflict internally, distress about having these attractions, but the attractions themselves were not seen as its own diagnosis. So that was the initial shift. And then what you're maybe referencing more recently is in 2009, there was a task force document that came out of the American Psychological Association that looked specifically at people who are seeking conversion therapy and what are the appropriate therapeutic interventions for people seeking that approach. And what they did was they looked at some of the research that was being offered to claim that attractions can change in therapy. They were looking at some of the harm that was being documented at the time around people who sought these interventions, higher suicide rates or suicide attempts in people navigating that type of therapy. And then really what they said was these are highly religious people, and we need to have kind of approaches that account for things like identity exploration and development, increasing social support, increasing acceptance of self. So receiving kind of all parts of me, kind of incorporating my values in ways that allow me to live in congruent ways, and really honoring religiosity as a diversity variable for people, which is pretty significant too, right? To say that, hey, let's help people account for their faith. We're not asking them to leave that at the door. And if we can't offer therapy that allows people to bring their faith in, they're actually probably more prone to seek conversion therapy than they otherwise would if they feel like that's the only faith congruent option. So that 2009 document was very influential and then was a catalyst. That language of that document became a real catalyst for some of the laws we see banning conversion therapy. When those laws were written, they were drawing from clinical language that was in that 2009 document and then
Mhm.
kind of confirmed in a 2015 SAMHSA document, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. So again, that's a little bit of the history there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
So,
that's helpful.
and this leads us into this question about the Supreme Court case, because so in this interim between 2009 and up to today, many jurisdictions in the US somehow outlawed conversion therapy, maybe poorly defined, at least for minors. But maybe, I don't actually know. Maybe some jurisdictions in the US also had for adults as well. I'm not sure, but I assume not. because of how the US usually handles adult choice. But yeah.
Yeah,
And
my sense is it's minors. I think you're right on that. Yeah.
got it. And actually, maybe I don't know how many like just states, for example, outlawed conversion therapy, but maybe you might know actually.
Yeah,
So,
it's over 20 states. I think it's at maybe 23, 22 or 23 in Washington,
okay.
D.C. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Got it. So then recently, this was challenged actually in Colorado, where you've been living. And there's a Supreme Court case. Let me make sure I get the name right. Chiles versus Salazar.
Yeah, Chiles versus Salazar. That's
Chiles,
right.
thank you. Chiles
Mhm,
versus
mhm.
Salazar. So we we've seen you in many circles or many spaces online in podcasts and writing and videos talking about your particular contribution to this case because I'd love to hear more about the case, but you also have submitted a brief, amicus or amicus brief, to support a particular side in the court case that is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. Could you share more about what is happening in this case and kind of where you came in with your particular kind of assistance to this one side or this one position rather than the other?
So, so yeah, the case came out of the 2019 ban in Colorado on conversion therapy, which again, that law is very similar to laws across the country that exist banning conversion therapy practices with minors in particular, and allowing people who want to seek pastoral care around same-sex attraction and seek change through ministry contexts, totally allowing that even in minors, but saying licensed mental health providers cannot offer that type of approach in therapy. And
Yeah.
so Kaylee Chiles is a licensed counselor in Colorado Springs who was trained at Denver Seminary, which was a Protestant seminary that I taught at for a few years when I moved to Colorado. And she is claiming in her lawsuit against the state that this law, as it's written, is a violation of her freedom of speech. So her argument really relies on this sense that therapy, because in her case, her claim is that the primary intervention she's using is speaking. And so when she speaks in therapy, she wants to be able to incorporate her beliefs and values as a Christian around, I think, sexual behavior, around embodiment and gender. And so her claim is that these laws, as they're written, restrict her freedom of speech, restrict what she can do with minors, and is so broad that the law actually restricts her from doing competent, effective therapy, specifically in the realm of gender. She really focuses her claims on kind of challenging gender affirming care and offering concerns about how the law itself is written as kind of what she calls viewpoint discrimination, or in the legal sphere, it's called viewpoint discrimination. So this idea that Colorado's law is siding with more affirming approaches in therapy and villainizing it, banning faith congruent approaches.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the fundamental claim. Now, it's worth naming nobody in the state of Colorado has been given any disciplinary action since this law was put out in 2019. I think what she would say is she and others like her are so afraid of being subject to penalty that they can't in good conscience do this work. And so the claim then is that they have to turn families away who are highly religious coming in seeking their care.
Mm-hmm.
So how did I get involved?
Yes.
I typically, and by typically I mean exclusively, would never kind of see myself as somebody stepping into the political or the legal domain. It only happened that a friend of mine, a person I respect in this space, got connected with the Attorney General's office and heard a bit about the case, which I was already
Mm.
aware of at the time, and that would have been this summer. And ultimately, long story short, the Attorney General's office and I met to just talk a little bit about the case, a little bit about the practice I'm offering in Colorado as a licensed psychologist who works with these families all the time that Kaylee is to have to turn away. And I really just offered some of the approach I take. I got very clear and consistent consensus from everybody in the AG's office that the types of approaches that I bring into therapy and others who are people of faith working in this space bring are absolutely licit under the law. And I was then asked to consider writing an amicus brief or an amicus brief. And again, at first, my sense was I didn't see myself as really doing that. But as I sat with it a little bit more, I thought about the fact that, people of faith framing this around conversion therapy or things like it being necessary options for people of faith who are minors felt like a real misrepresentation of a faith-based perspective. And I didn't want there to be this homogenous sense that what Kaylee Chiles is arguing is what all people of faith who are theologically conservative think about this. So I and others, submitted briefs to really just offer perspective on what are people of faith who are working in this area and walking with people regularly seeing, and how are we practicing ethically and under laws like this? And what do I see as some of the benefits of these laws being in place? What have I witnessed as a psychologist? So that's a little bit of how that came to be.
So how have people responded to you in particular being kind of submitting your particular brief for the side over the other? I've seen some interesting parties, like some kind of secular gay organizations that be happy that you were doing this. They're like, wow, this conservative Christian, she's supporting like this thing that we think is bad. But yeah, how has the response been to your work in this area, in this current chapter?
Yeah. So it was maybe a blessing that at the time I didn't think much about what the reaction would be. I just felt compelled to do it. And so I didn't calculate that very much at all. But as I started writing the brief, of course, I was witnessing some of the briefs for Chiles' side come in, and many theologically conservative organizations, many Catholic organizations, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops wrote a brief on the other side. And here I was coming out publicly saying I'm on the side of the state of Colorado in this case. And so I think that in and of itself has been very confusing to people. Even AI took a while for the AI on Google to get it right what position I was. They kept saying she wrote a side of Chiles. So I think that maybe shows you some of the polarity here, that there is a fundamental assumption that people of faith and their interests would not be represented by a state like Colorado. And anybody who's speaking up in a Supreme Court case around religious freedom would be homogenous in their opinion on this. So that in and of itself was very striking to me. And then, I think the feedback I got initially was there were certainly people of faith who were relieved to read the brief, who felt like it, practitioners who work in these spaces who felt like that was representing what they're trying to do and offer in therapy, a kind of third way to more strictly affirming approaches or conversion therapy approaches. And so that was helpful to hear that others were really feeling a lot of resonance when they were doing work in this area. Certainly, there are also people who are doing kind of approaches that I would put under the umbrella of conversion therapy who are really upset and concerned about me kind of speaking out in this way. And then there were, interestingly, a lot of opportunities to connect with people who were people from more of the maybe mainstream LGBT community and advocacy world. And I was shocked, to be honest with you, at the receptivity to what I had to say from organizations like GLAAD and PFLAG, who I started to really connect with and talk to. And many people at those organizations were raised in faith communities. And I would get on a call with somebody and they'd say, oh my gosh, it's so interesting to hear what you have to say. And I can resonate with some things about what you're talking about. And I think that has been, really meaningful to as a Christian, get to bear witness to, I hope, a kind of Christian approach to these spaces that is nuanced and kind of able to hold things that feel conflicting at the same time. And so again, it's been so meaningful to talk with so many people who are working in advocacy who were not polarized in how they engaged with me, who were willing to give me the benefit of the doubt, who maybe had some suspicions about me and had good questions to ask me. Is important, but weren't willing to just throw out my perspective as a person of faith. And the Attorney General's office was another example of this. And so to be honest, professionally and personally, it was so helpful to know that, wow, maybe things are not as polarized in the sides here as sometimes it's framed in the common corner. And then I did a couple of things like a PBS interview and an interview at a local station in Colorado. And I'm aware that there was some pretty negative feedback from progressive voices who felt like I didn't go far enough,
Yeah.
or actually didn't hear what I said. And because of maybe how I presented, or because I was introduced as a Christian, assumed about what they thought. I just think that speaks to the stimulus value of people of faith right now, is that we fundamentally lack any kind of nuance or thoughtfulness, and inherently kind of are the interests of LGBT people, which is part of why I did what I did in speaking up.
Thank you.
And even right now, I'm thinking about, we might need to add a little bit more of an intro to this episode, because listeners right now could be hearing this and saying, oh, they're speaking positively for Salazar, the state of Colorado, for the well-being of queer SSA people. They must be holding affirming perspectives. and just the tropes that which is not, well, depends on it. We affirm our love of people and the well-being of people, gay and straight, but we don't affirm same-sex sexual activity or marriage, what words end up meaning to people. But anyways, just to that point of, yeah, how easily we get thrown in different buckets. So I'm really grateful you've been able to represent a third way in some of these conversations. And I'm curious, on the actual kind of legal argument, do you have any thoughts on Chiles's kind of argument around freedom of speech? And like, would you say to Chiles, I actually do think your practice does go against what the state is saying? Or are you saying, from what I understand what you're saying, you actually can practice what you're practicing? Like, do you see her as actually pushing against the law, or she's just creating a fight for the sake of religious freedom, using the freedom of speech as kind of a leverage where there doesn't need to be a fight?
Yeah, so my initial impression was very much the latter. My initial impression was very much that this was being framed as a religious, kind of a freedom of speech argument. But when I read what she was claiming that she wanted to do in therapy, my impression was that's absolutely fine under the law. If somebody comes to you and they have gender distress and they have a history of severe depression and trauma, you absolutely can address their trauma in therapy. That's totally fine with a minor. Minors come to therapy to address trauma all the time. And so that's fine under the law. You can help people with identity exploration and development. And if a teen comes to you at the start of therapy and says, I would like to align with my sex, I would like to live in accordance with my sex, and you say, okay, I can work with you, tell me a little bit about that. You'd have to be honest that we don't have evidence-based treatment interventions that do that. But you can certainly, if somebody says, I want to align with my sex, work with them as a minor. And even in the cases of somebody who comes to therapy and says, I'm same-sex attracted or I'm gay and I want to refrain from sexual activity as a minor, can you help me find coping skills? The law allows for adaptive coping skills. What I will say is in some of the writing that she does, she starts to, as time goes on, in some of the documentation submitted to the Supreme Court, seemingly say, no, I really do want to do things that would count as conversion therapy. Like, I really do want to claim that people can align with their sex through therapeutic intervention, that God's best for people is alignment with their sex, and I ought to be able to talk about that explicitly with people, and the law is banning that. And I think that gets maybe not so much at what the law is banning, but maybe a very different approach to therapy that I have a lot of thoughts about. I think as soon as clinicians who are licensed start framing therapy as merely the therapist talking and me speaking like I would speak to you all at a restaurant, or taking therapy outside of the context of medical and mental health treatment into the realm of what I would call mentorship or coaching, where if all I'm doing in therapy is speaking to people and telling them what I think about sexual ethics or sexual behavior, I really am not doing therapy, is what I would argue. And so I found it to be a really interesting and concerning, frankly, argument from Christians when I know that so many Christians already have a stigma against therapy, already think therapy can't really help them, already think therapy is just paying for a friend, when therapy, in my estimation, at its best, is using the best of evidence we have from research to inform clinical theories and interventions in a way that actually helps people with diagnosable mental health concerns. And so the fundamental argument in the case is therapy medical treatment, or is therapy talking and speech that then would be
Interesting.
protected under the First Amendment? I would not want to be a person who is charging significant amount of money
Sure.
for
For just talking.
I do think that you can do that elsewhere for free. And so I'm really concerned about how stigma is actually impacting this conversation and leading people to believe therapy is merely talking to somebody who's older than you and a person of faith. I think as soon as we say that, we've lost the whole point of what mental health care is or ought to be.
May I ask, is this becoming, you think, a larger issue now with maybe some people who are in the position of Chiles? Chiles, right? That's her name? Is it becoming a larger issue because of contemporary politics around transgender identities in the US? Because it sounds like to me, you mentioned that she said, well, I really want to tell people they should align with their birth sex, which kind of implies a certain perspective around transgender people, which relates to sexuality, but also can be distinct. Yeah, so I'm just wondering if it's kind of ratcheted up because of the U.S. politics around transgender right now. But maybe 3 years ago, she wouldn't have brought this forward because it was not as prominent of a conversation. Of course, speculation, but I'm just curious. Yeah.
No, I think you're hitting on something that a lot of the kind of journalism space has been focused on in this case, is it seems like what happened in this case and the timing of it in particular was there is a lot of disillusionment and mistrust in gender affirming care, that model of care in our country. There's concerns about medical interventions in minors and whether that ought to be kind of accessible to minors. And so it's interesting when you read Chiles' reflections and the briefs on her side that they really are focused on kind of saying that this law is allowing only for gender affirmation and not allowing for people to explore identity without aligning with a trans identity.
Yeah.
And so I think you're exactly right, TJ, that not only Chiles, but actually more broadly, when I spoke with many journalists across the political spectrum, there was a sense that maybe the law was siding with gender affirming care in a way that made a lot of people concerned kind of across the political spectrum. And I think that again speaks to broader political climate questions of the concern and debate around trans care, and certainly just some of the kind of undignifying treatment of people who identify as trans in the political rhetoric. I think all of those things are converging right now in the timing of this case coming forward and having the kind of compelling nature that I think it has had for people. Because when people hear, yes, you can identify with the opposite sex, but you can't identify with your sex as a minor, that gets a lot of people's attention if this is being framed.
Yeah. I know we have to wrap up shortly, but I want to say also thank you for your work in this area. I was really discouraged when I heard about this case and I was like, why is this coming back? And also I was discouraged when I saw that you said the U.S. Conference of Bishops from the Catholic Church, they were on the side of Chiles. And I was just like, why is this happening? Like, why are these Christians who I have a lot of affinity for, why are they still supporting this particular side when, again, in my circles, it's seen as conversion therapy and related approaches are seen as detrimental to human flourishing, actually. They seem to promise things that make life worse, or use methods sometimes which make life worse rather than improve outcomes for people and allow them to flourish. So just that, thank you so much for your work. And I'm glad you could provide this alternative perspective for people to see that Christians or people of faith are thoughtful, nuanced, and are actually trying to follow the best evidence we have in some of these interventions for people's health and like life. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you for the work you all are doing too, because it's
Thank
so
you.
important and it's going to be increasingly important, right? That kind of demonstrating the landscape of Christian voices and the spirit of freedom of speech that we can all contribute our
Yeah.
perspective in this space is really key. And maybe just a comment on what you mentioned as far as the discouragement in some of the loud voices. I do think a lot of the people who wrote briefs on the side of Chiles, represent maybe a misunderstanding of the law and how there works and ought to work. And so I am concerned like you about the kind of optics of that. And
Yeah.
also I think I read some of those briefs, it became apparent to me that it's not so much that they're saying conversion therapy is a good thing. It's that they're believing the framing here that this is a freedom of speech issue.
Sure.
And I think they're wrong about that. But I understand the concern and mistrust around laws today. I just don't think this is one that we ought to be concerned about as Christians.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. We will be continuing to pray for your practice, the voice that the Lord gives you in any of these spaces. And I'm just, eager for the church to be growing in wisdom and its witness in these conversations. Do you know a time frame for when this case might seek resolution?
So it's looking like it'll be May or June of next year that at the
Okay.
latest that the decision would come out. I think June is kind of the last deadline, but probably
Okay.
May or June we'll know a decision. And regardless of the outcome of the case, my hope is that if the ban is overturned, we can help states like Colorado put together laws that are clear and kind of have enough nuance in them to be clear about what's being banned and what's not. So my hope is it's not the last opportunity to protect youth from these practices that are harmful. It just might be a bump in the road to kind of wordsmith a bit more to make sure we're clear in some of these laws and how they're written.
Yeah. Julia, where else might people find your work or find any resources you've developed?
So if people want to follow along my work, the best way is my website, which is easy enough, my first and last name.com, juliasadusky.com. And, I have social media platforms that you can follow along with. I'm doing a bit of writing on Substack right now, but I have a newsletter through my website that allows you to get kind of the latest resources, books and writings I'm doing month to month. So I'd love for people to follow along that way if they're interested.
Thank you so much, and hope to chat with you again in the future.
Yeah.
I would.
Thanks, listeners, for joining.
Have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Talk soon. Bye.
Yep, sounds good. This podcast is fully supported by people like you who want to see it continue. If you like this podcast, first, please consider sharing it with a friend who might also like it. Referrals from others are the biggest way people find our podcast. And second, please consider supporting this podcast on Substack. Starting at $5 a month, you can ensure this podcast continues, and you'll also get access to our subscribers-only WhatsApp group for new kinship supporters. We'd love to hear from you as we continue to pursue diverse perspectives and nuanced conversations around sexuality, ethnicity, desire, and belonging in the kingdom of Christ.